Peace be with you. We hear Jesus repeat that message and that word as his first greeting to the disciples after he rose from the dead. It brings us to the question of what is meant by peace. It's that which we seek, which every human heart searches for. But what is the nature of it? In our first reading, we have a description of the first Christians very soon after the resurrection. They're gathering, they're sharing all things in common, they're being generous with one another. It's an image of people at peace. But we know from our history that this scenario would change very quickly. In the Acts of the Apostles, it changes very quickly as the early Christians begin to experience severe persecution from the Jewish authorities. And we know that in the first few centuries of the church, the Roman Empire would so brutally persecute the early Christians and kill them in their thousands. We know today from a recent report by the Anglican Bishop of Truro that the situation is really not particularly different today. Christians are such a persecuted religious minority across the world. Blood is being shed because people believe in the risen Lord. And yet, despite all of this extreme suffering of so many throughout the history of the church, throughout these 2,000 years since the church has been in existence, and today, Christians gather together to proclaim what the response to our psalm proclaimed, and this is profound. Give thanks to the Lord, for he is good, for his love has no end. In great suffering, we see that the early church and throughout the history of the church has shown great faith. People have demonstrated incredible faith and belief in this truth that is at the center of our faith and our worship, particularly in Easter tide. But of course it's difficult. And I think of all of you who are watching. Many of you who are suffering in so many different ways. Some who've lost loved ones. Some who can't be with loved ones. Some who've lost their business. Great suffering is going on at home, I know. And I know it is so difficult for many of you sitting there and watching the Mass to feel that you actually can believe and say those words of the psalm that we've just heard. Give thanks to the Lord, for he is good, for his love has no end. But I want to assure you who are watching and suffering that you do believe this. How's that, Father? Because you're here. Because you've come to Mass. And you have come to Mass to see, albeit through a television screen and not in full presence physically, the proof of what our psalm says. The proof that still we can give thanks to the Lord, for he is good, for his love is without end. Why? Because he continues to give us, his disciples, his body. Just as he gave his body today in that incredible gospel reading we've just heard to doubting Thomas and asked him to touch him, to have intimate contact with his risen body. His risen body that we know and learn today in the gospel account is risen but wounded, and that's significant for all of you who suffer, because it proves to us that there is hope beyond hurt. beyond pain, there is that hope that Jesus promises each and every one of us of perfect peace. We get the great teaching and insight into the nature of the peace that our hearts hope for in our second reading, which comes from the letter of St. Peter, where St. Peter says to us towards the end of that you are sure of the end to which your faith looks forward. That end is the Lord. It's not a passing peace that we should be focusing our gaze on, not on this world. It's not the passing peace that the disciples experienced those 2,000 years ago in Jerusalem that we heard of in our first reading. Their eyes were fixed on the eternal and perfect peace, the peace which is prophesied to us by the prophet Micah in the readings at Advent and confirmed for us in the writing of St. Paul to the Ephesians when he says to us very simply and specifically, He, the Lord Jesus Christ, is our peace. To believe that, to trust in the Lord is difficult, but it is what we are called to do. Image came to me when I was thinking and writing my sermon yesterday of what I think is the greatest of the Indiana Jones films, The Last Crusade. If you've not seen it, put it on the queue to watch for yourselves, maybe later today or in the week. At the end of The Last Crusade, Indiana Jones, of course, in that film is searching, we could say, for Christ. He's looking for the Holy Grail, of course, but we'd say that he is searching symbolically for the Lord. And he has so many obstacles to overcome. And then right at the end, he gets to step out where there is a great chasm beneath him, separating him from the Lord. And he is asked to step out when it seems that there is nothing to support him at all, to step out in faith, to get to the Lord Jesus. And just as he's feeling as though he just can't do it, it's completely impossible for him to reach the Lord. You hear his father, played by Sean Connery, in the background, his father who loves him, say and repeat, "You must believe, boy. You must believe." Indiana Jones puts his foot out and steps down into the abyss and is supported by a bridge over which he crosses to reach the destination. That bridge symbolically for us is the church and her sacraments. It is the church through whom we come to encounter the perfect peace that is Christ. Let us give thanks today to the Lord, for he is good. And let us all profess together in our hearts and aloud with our voices, his love has no end.